Before we begin, if you've ever watched someone lose their memory, this story will stay with you. If it makes you think about the secrets we carry and the truths we need to tell before it's too late, leave a comment below. And if you want more real cases like this, make sure you're subscribed. Because what I found inside Dorothy Raines changed everything I knew about memory, guilt, and what the dying try to tell us. My name is Dr. Nathan Cross, and I've been a medical examiner for 17 years. In that time, I've learned that death is rarely the end of a story. It's usually the beginning of one. Every body that comes to my table has secrets written in tissue and bone, stories that the living either don't know or won't tell. But on December 9th, 2019, I examined a 72-year-old woman named Dorothy Raines, and what I discovered led me down a path I never expected. A path that ended 40 years in the past, with a buried body, a forgotten friend, and a woman whose disease took everything from her except the one memory that mattered most. This is the story of how Alzheimer's disease, that cruel thief of memory, somehow preserved the one thing Dorothy Raines needed to remember, and how, in her final days when she couldn't recognize her own daughter, she remembered exactly where she'd buried her best friend. The call came at 7:15 a.m. on a Monday morning. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee, and watching the Seattle rain streak down the windows. December in the Pacific Northwest means darkness until 8 a.m. and a cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. "Dr. Cross, we have an intake for you," the morgue administrator said. "Natural death, 72-year-old female. Family is requesting autopsy." "What's the suspected cause?" "Cardiac failure. She had advanced Alzheimer's, been in decline for years. But the daughter wants to know if there was anything else, anything they missed." Natural deaths with autopsy requests usually indicate family members seeking closure, trying to understand if they could have done more, if they could have seen the signs earlier, if they could have prevented the inevitable. I understood that need. My own mother was 71, and every time she forgot where she'd put her keys or couldn't remember a word, I felt that intense fear. Would I lose her the same way too? Would I watch her disappear piece by piece until nothing remained but a body that breathed? I arrived at the morgue at 8:30, and Maya Cortez was already there, reviewing the intake paperwork. She looked up when I walked in, her expression troubled. "Morning, DeCross. I've been reading the hospital notes on this one. It's unusual." "How so?" "Dorothy Raines was admitted to the psychiatric unit 3 days before she died. Not because of typical Alzheimer's behavior, but because she became fixated on something. Kept saying she needed to find someone named Linda, that they'd buried her and she needed to be found before it was too late." I pulled off my coat and reached for the file. Alzheimer's patients often have fixations, false memories, confabulations. The disease rewires the brain in strange ways. I know. But Dr. Cross, look at the notes from the psychiatrist. He said her lucidity during these episodes was remarkable. She couldn't remember her daughter's name, couldn't remember what year it was, but she could recite specific coordinates, latitude and longitude, down to the decimal point. She wrote them over and over. I scanned through the psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Raymond Chen had documented everything carefully. Dorothy Raines had been brought in by her daughter after 3 nights of increasingly agitated behavior. She would wake at 3 a.m., insisting they needed to go dig, that Linda had been alone too long, that she'd promised to come back. The coordinates were documented, 47,99945 by Dinan 121.865 www. "Did anyone check what's at those coordinates?" I asked. I looked it up. It's a rural property in Snohomish County. Old farmland, mostly abandoned now. Nothing significant. Did the daughter know who Linda was? Maya shook her head. According to the notes, Susan Raines, that's the daughter, said she'd never heard her mother mention anyone named Linda. Not in recent years, not ever. I set down the file and looked at Maya. Let's see what the body tells us. We wheeled Dorothy Raines into Autopsy Room 4. The room was cold, maintained at a steady 58 degrees, the air sharp with disinfectant. I've performed over 2,000 autopsies in rooms just like this one, and I've learned to separate emotion from observation, to see the body as evidence rather than a person. But when I pulled back the sheet and saw Dorothy Raines's face, something made me pause. She looked peaceful. That's not unusual, many people do after death. The muscles relax, the pain leaves, and what remains is just a shell. But there was something else in her expression. Relief, maybe. Or resolution. Like she'd finished something important just before the end. "Start the recorder," I said, pulling on my gloves. The digital system beeped to life, and I began the external examination. December 9th, 2019, 9:15 a.m. Subject is an adult female, identified as Dorothy Ann Raines, age 72. Deceased was found unresponsive in her residence by her daughter at approximately 6:30 a.m. on December 8th. Paramedics pronounced death at the scene at 6:52 a.m. Medical history includes advanced Alzheimer's disease, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. I moved around the table systematically, documenting every detail. Dorothy had been a small woman, maybe 5'2", thin in the way that long-term illness makes people thin. Her gray hair was cut short, practical. Her hands showed the age spots and slight tremor patterns common in Alzheimer's patients. And that's when I noticed something strange. "Maya, bring the magnification light over here." She wheeled the surgical lamp closer, and I examined Dorothy's right hand more carefully under the bright light. Beneath her fingernails, there was dirt. Not the surface dirt you might get from gardening or handling soil. This was embedded, packed into the nail beds and the cuticle margins. Dark, clay soil that had been there for a while. "She has soil under her nails," I said. "Document this. Photograph from multiple angles." "Could she have been gardening recently?" Maya asked, positioning the camera. "In December, in Seattle, and with advanced Alzheimer's, her daughter would have had to supervise any outdoor activity." I used a small tool to extract samples from beneath each nail. "Bag these separately. I want to know what kind of soil this is and how long it's been there." I continued the external examination. Both hands showed the same soil deposits, and when I looked more carefully at her palms, I could see faint abrasions, old and healed but still visible, like she'd been digging with her bare hands at some point. Then I checked her pockets. In the right pocket of the cardigan she'd been wearing when she died, folded into a small square, was a piece of paper. The paper was old, yellowed, the creases worn soft from being folded and unfolded many times. I carefully unfolded it and laid it flat on the examination tray. Written in shaky but deliberate handwriting were the same coordinates the hospital had documented. 47.945 DG N 121.8665 DG WW. And beneath them, in the same handwriting, "Linda Mercer, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." There was something else on the paper. In the top corner, barely visible, was a dark brown stain. I knew that stain. I'd seen it thousands of times. "Maya, prep this for testing. That's blood. Recent? No. This stain is old. Decades old, if I had to guess." I photographed the note from every angle, making sure every word was clearly visible. But someone kept this note for a very long time, kept it close. I moved on to the internal examination. making the standard Y incision and opening the thoracic cavity. The heart showed the expected changes of chronic heart disease. Enlarged, with thick ventricle walls from years of hypertension. The coronary arteries were significantly narrowed with atherosclerotic plaque. Cause of death appears to be acute myocardial infarction secondary to coronary artery disease, I dictated. Contributing factors include advanced age and multiple comorbidities. But it was when I examined her hands more closely under the microscope that I found something impossible. The soil beneath her fingernails wasn't just on the surface. It was embedded in the deeper layers of the skin under the nail bed. Soil particles were trapped in tissue that takes months to grow out, tissue that would have been deep beneath the nail plate when the exposure occurred. This soil has been here for months, I said to Maya. Maybe 6 months or more. It's been growing out with the nail, but there's so much of it that traces remain even in the newer growth. How is that possible? Wouldn't she wash her hands? You would think so. Unless the exposure was so heavy, so prolonged, that the soil became embedded too deeply to wash out. Like she'd been digging in this soil for hours. Days, maybe. I took samples of the tissue beneath the nails and prepared them for both soil analysis and tissue dating. If we could determine when this exposure occurred, we might understand what Dorothy had been doing in the months before her death. The rest of the autopsy revealed nothing unusual for a woman her age with her medical history. The Alzheimer's had done its terrible work on her brain, the characteristic plaques and tangles visible even to gross examination. But her other organs, while aged, showed no signs of acute disease or trauma. I was finishing the closing sutures when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Susan Raines, Dorothy's daughter. Ms. Raines, I answered. I'm just completing your mother's examination, Dr. Cross, I need to talk to you. Can I come there to your office? Her voice was tight, strained. I found something in my mother's belongings, something I think you need to see. Of course. When can you be here? I'm in the parking lot. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to decide if I should come in. I met Susan in my office 15 minutes later. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in jeans and a heavy sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a small wooden box in her hands like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Thank you for seeing me, she said, sitting in the chair across from my desk. I don't even know where to start. Take your time. She set the box on my desk, her hands trembling slightly. This was in my mother's closet, in the back, behind her shoes. I was cleaning out her things and I found it. I've never seen it before. She must have hidden it. What's inside? A journal from 1983, the year I was 10 years old. She pushed the box toward me. Dr. Cross, my mother wrote about killing someone, about burying them, and about spending the next 40 years trying to forget. I opened the box slowly. Inside was a small leather journal, the kind with a lock that had long since broken. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but still legible. I opened to the first entry. June 3rd, 1983. The handwriting was steady, nothing like the shaky script on the note I'd found in Dorothy's pocket. I did something terrible today. I don't know if I can write it down, but I need to. I need to remember, even though I want so desperately to forget. Linda is gone, and it's my fault. I looked up at Susan. Who was Linda? I don't know. I've never heard that name in my life. She wiped her eyes. My mother had Alzheimer's for 15 years. She forgot me, forgot my father, forgot her own name sometimes. But in the hospital, those last 3 days, she remembered Linda. She remembered coordinates. She remembered something that happened 40 years ago like it was yesterday. I turned the pages carefully, scanning through entries that detailed a friendship, a betrayal, and finally, a death. And as I read, I realized that Dorothy Raines hadn't been suffering from confabulation or false memories. She'd been trying, with the last functioning parts of her failing brain, to confess to a murder. I've learned over the years that the dead rarely lie. Their bodies tell the truth in ways that words never can. But what I hadn't fully understood until that December afternoon, sitting across from Susan Raines with her mother's journal open on my desk, was that sometimes the dying need to tell the truth more desperately than anything else. Dorothy Raines had spent 15 years losing her mind to Alzheimer's disease. She'd forgotten her daughter's face, forgotten how to cook, forgotten the address of the house she'd lived in for 40 years. But in those final days when almost everything else was gone, she remembered Linda Mercer. And she remembered what they'd done to her. I continued reading the journal while Susan sat quietly, occasionally wiping tears from her face. The entries painted a picture of two women in their early 30s, best friends since childhood, living in a small community north of Seattle. June 3, 1983. Linda came to the house today while Robert was at work. She said she needed to talk to me about something important. I made coffee, and we sat in the kitchen like we've done 1,000 times before. But this time was different. This time, Linda told me she'd been having an affair with Robert, my husband, for 6 months. June 4th, 1983. I confronted Robert last night. He denied it at first, but then he got angry. Angrier than I've ever seen him. He said Linda was lying, that she was jealous of our marriage, trying to break us apart. He said if I believed her over him, I was a fool. I wanted to believe him. God help me. I wanted to believe him. June 5, 1983. Linda called me this morning. She said she has proof, letters, photos. She said she was going to tell everyone that Robert needed to face consequences for what he'd done, for the lies he'd told both of us. She said she was coming over tonight, that we needed to talk, all three of us. She said it was time for the truth. The next entry was longer, written in a hand that grew progressively more shaky, more desperate. June 6, 1983. Linda came to the house at 7 p.m. Robert was already home. I'd told him she was coming, that she claimed to have proof. I thought if we all sat down together, we could work it out. We could find the truth. But when Linda arrived, Robert changed. He became someone I didn't recognize. He grabbed her by the arm, started yelling at her, calling her terrible names. Linda tried to leave, but he wouldn't let her. They fought. Physically fought. I tried to stop them, but Robert pushed me aside, and then Linda fell. She hit her head on the corner of the fireplace. The sound, I'll never forget that sound. She just fell and didn't get up. There was so much blood. Robert checked for a pulse. There was nothing. She was gone. Just like that. My best friend was gone. I paused in my reading, looking at Susan. Did you know any of this? Did you know your father was violent? Susan shook her head slowly. No. Never. My father he was quiet, reserved. He worked as an accountant, came home every night at 6, read the newspaper, watched TV. We weren't close, but he wasn't violent. At least, not that I ever saw. When did he die? 1995, heart attack. He was 58. She looked at her hands. I was 22, and honestly, I didn't grieve much. I know that sounds terrible, but we never had a real relationship. He was just there, this distant figure who happened to live in the same house. I turned back to the journal, to the entries that followed. June 6, 1983. Continued. Robert said we had to think, had to be smart. He said it was an accident, that no one would believe us, that we'd both go to prison. He said Susan was only 10 years old, that she needed her parents. He said we had to protect our family. I was in shock. I couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. And then Robert made a decision. He said we had to bury her. We had to make her disappear. I said no. I said we had to call the police, that it was an accident, they would understand. But Robert grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises. He said if I called anyone, he'd say I did it, that I attacked Linda out of jealousy, that he tried to stop me but failed. And I believed him. God help me, I believed him. June 7th, 1983. We did it last night. Drove her body to the old property Robert inherited from his uncle. Land that no one uses, no one visits. We buried her in the woods. It took hours. Robert dug while I watched, making sure no one came. The hole was so deep, 4 feet down into clay soil. When it was done, we drove home in silence. Susan asked where I'd been. I told her I'd been sick, that I'd stayed in bed all day. She believed me. Everyone believed us. Linda Mercer just disappeared. Her family filed a missing person report. The police came and asked questions. I lied. I lied to everyone. And with each lie, something inside me died. The remaining entries showed a woman slowly unraveling. Entries became sporadic, desperate, filled with guilt and self-recrimination. July 15th, 1983. I can't eat, can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see Linda's face, see the blood, hear that terrible sound. I'm haunted by what we did, by what I helped him do. I should have called the police, should have stood up to Robert, but I was afraid. And that fear has turned me into something I don't recognize. August 3rd, 1983. Robert acts like nothing happened. Goes to work, comes home, lives his life. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers, if he's capable of just forgetting. I wish I could forget. I wish I could erase that night from my mind. But I can't. I'll never be able to. The last entry was dated September 12, 1983. I'm hiding this journal, hiding it where Robert will never find it. Maybe someday, when I'm brave enough, I'll tell someone. I'll confess what we did. Linda deserves justice. Her family deserves to know. But today, I'm still too much of a coward. Today, I'm still choosing my own safety over the truth. I'm sorry, Linda. I'm so sorry. I closed the journal carefully and looked at Susan. She was crying quietly now, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. How could she remember this after all these years? She couldn't remember me, couldn't remember my name, my face, anything about my life. But she remembered Linda. She remembered coordinates from 40 years ago. Trauma works differently in the brain than normal memories, I said gently. Traumatic events, especially ones tied to intense emotion and guilt, get encoded in deeper neural structures. The hippocampus, which Alzheimer's damages first, handles everyday memories, but emotional trauma can be stored in the amygdala, in structures that sometimes survive longer as the disease progresses. So the disease took everything from her except her guilt. In a way, yes. As the Alzheimer's advanced, as it stripped away her recent memories, her identity, her ability to recognize loved ones, it eventually reached these deeper, older memories. And instead of erasing them, it brought them to the surface. Without all the other memories to contextualize them, to suppress them, the trauma became the only thing she could remember. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Those last 3 days in the hospital, when she kept saying Linda's name, when she kept writing those coordinates, she was trying to confess. She was trying to make it right before she died. I believe so. Dr. Cross, we have to go there. To those coordinates, we have to see if... She couldn't finish the sentence. I pulled out my phone and opened a mapping application, entering the coordinates Dorothy had written so carefully. The location appeared on screen, a rural area in Snohomish County, about 40 miles north of Seattle. The property was marked as private land, undeveloped forest. "I need to contact Detective Blake," I said. "He handles cold cases. If there's any chance Linda Mercer is buried at those coordinates, this becomes a police matter." "But you'll go there too? You'll see this through?" I looked at Susan Raines, at this woman who'd just discovered that her mother had been carrying a terrible secret for 4 decades, that her father had been a killer, that her entire childhood had been built on a lie. "Yes," I said, "I'll see it through." Detective Warren Blake arrived at my office an hour later. I'd worked with him for years on various cases, and I knew he had a reputation for solving cold cases that other detectives had given up on. I handed him Dorothy's journal and the note we'd found in her pocket. He read through everything carefully, his weathered face showing no emotion until he finished. "Linda Mercer," he said finally. "That name sounds familiar." He pulled out his phone and made several calls, speaking in the shorthand that police use among themselves. When he hung up, he looked at both Susan and me. "Linda Mercer was reported missing on June 7, 1983. She was 31 years old, worked as a secretary at a real estate office in Everett. The case was investigated extensively, but no evidence of foul play was ever found. No body, no witnesses, no leads. It went cold within 6 months. Her family never got answers." He paused. "They deserve answers now." "Can we go to the coordinates?" Susan asked. "Can we check if she's really there?" "I'll need to get a search warrant first. We can't just dig up private property without authorization. But given what you've shown me, given Dr. Cross's findings about the soil under Dorothy's fingernails, I think I can get approval quickly." He looked at his watch. "Give me until tomorrow morning. I'll coordinate with the county sheriff's office and get a team together." After Blake left, I returned to the laboratory where Maya had been running tests on the samples we'd collected during Dorothy's autopsy. She looked up when I entered, her expression troubled. "Dr. Cross, the soil analysis came back. It's not standard Seattle area soil. It's a specific type of clay-rich soil with high iron content. The lab cross-referenced it with geological surveys." She pulled up data on the computer screen. "It's consistent with soil found in eastern Snohomish County, specifically in the area around those coordinates. So Dorothy was there, recently enough that the soil was still embedded in her nail beds. There's more. I tested the age of the tissue where the soil was embedded. Based on nail growth rates, that soil exposure happened approximately 3 to 4 months ago, September or early October." I thought about that timeline. She was still living at home then. Her Alzheimer's was advanced, but she was still mobile, still capable of basic activities. Could she have driven herself there? Not likely. By that stage, she would have needed supervision. But Susan said her mother occasionally had good days, periods of temporary clarity. Maybe during one of those periods, Dorothy managed to get there. Managed to return to the place where they'd buried Linda Mercer. I pulled up Dorothy's medical records on my computer, looking for any documentation from that time period. And there it was. On September 23rd, Dorothy had been brought to the emergency room by a concerned neighbor. The intake notes read, "Patient found wandering on residential street, disoriented and confused. Clothes and hands covered in soil. No injuries noted. Unable to provide coherent explanation for condition. Daughter notified and retrieved patient from ER." I called Susan immediately. "Susan, this is Dr. Cross. I need to ask you about September 23rd. Your mother was brought to an ER that day." "Oh God, I remember that day. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, found my mom 3 blocks from home. She was filthy, covered in dirt, and she couldn't tell anyone where she'd been. I thought she'd fallen in someone's garden or gotten confused and wandered into a construction site. The ER doctor said she was fine physically, just confused and agitated. I brought her home, gave her a bath, and increased her supervision after that. Susan, I think your mother went to those coordinates that day. I think she found the burial site and tried to dig Linda out, but she couldn't finish. She wasn't strong enough. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then quietly, with her bare hands, the soil deposits suggest prolonged contact, hours maybe. She was trying to uncover her best friend with her bare hands, but an elderly woman with advanced Alzheimer's, she just didn't have the strength to dig deep enough. That's why Mrs. Patterson found her exhausted and confused, covered in dirt but unable to explain what she'd been doing. Jesus Christ, Susan's voice broke. Even with Alzheimer's, even with everything else gone, she was still trying to make it right, still trying to bring Linda home. The next morning, December 10th, I drove north to Snohomish County with Detective Blake, Susan, and a team that included a forensic anthropologist, 2 deputies, and specialized ground-penetrating radar equipment. The property was exactly where Dorothy's coordinates indicated, an overgrown piece of forested land that hadn't been maintained in decades. The trees were thick here, mostly evergreens, their branches heavy with December rain. The ground was soft, muddy, covered in moss and fallen needles. It felt like a place where secrets could be kept for 40 years. As we approached the exact coordinates, Blake stopped suddenly, raising his hand to halt the team behind him. He crouched down, examining the ground carefully. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. "Recently." I moved closer and saw what he meant. In a small clearing, the earth showed signs of disturbance. Not the natural settling of 40 years, but fresh excavation. The soil was darker here, recently turned. Small piles of dirt sat at the edges of a shallow depression, maybe 18 inches deep and 3 feet across. The digging was chaotic, desperate. No clean edges, no systematic excavation. This hadn't been done with tools. "Oh my God," Susan whispered, her hand covering her mouth. My mother actually tried to dig her up. Blake pulled out a flashlight and shone it into the shallow hole. The sides were rough, scratched and clawed rather than cut. At the bottom, I could see fingernail marks in the clay-rich soil, desperate scrapes where someone had torn at the earth with their bare hands. "This is where the soil under her nails came from," I said, my voice tight. "Dorothy found this spot, probably during one of those brief moments of lucidity Alzheimer's patients sometimes experience. She remembered the coordinates, she found this place, and she tried to dig Linda out." "Why didn't she finish?" one of the deputies asked. I looked at the shallow excavation, thinking about Dorothy Raines at 72 years old, suffering from advanced Alzheimer's, her body failing along with her mind. Because she couldn't. She didn't have the strength, didn't have the tools. An elderly woman with a degenerative disease trying to dig through 4 feet of compacted clay soil with her bare hands. I shook my head. It was impossible, but she tried anyway. Susan knelt beside the hole, her fingers tracing the marks her mother had left in the soil. "How long do you think she was here, before the neighbor found her?" I thought about the amount of soil embedded in Dorothy's nail beds, the depth of the excavation, the exhaustion such an effort would have caused. Hours, maybe 3 or 4. She was here for hours digging, trying to reach Linda, until she was so exhausted she could barely stand. That's when Mrs. Patterson found her, confused and covered in dirt, unable to explain where she'd been or what she'd been doing. Blake's radio crackled to life. The ground-penetrating radar technician who'd been scanning the area called out, "Detective, I've got something." Approximately 4 feet down, directly beneath the existing excavation, soil disturbance pattern consistent with a burial. We all looked at the shallow hole Dorothy had managed to dig. 18 inches. She'd made it 18 inches toward her friend. But Linda was still 30 inches below that, waiting in the dark, exactly where Dorothy and Robert had left her 40 years ago. "She almost made it," Susan said softly, tears streaming down her face. "She tried so hard, and she almost made it. But she didn't fail," I said, putting my hand on Susan's shoulder. "She found this place. She marked it with her effort. She left the coordinates so someone else could finish what she started. Your mother may not have been strong enough to dig Linda out herself, but she was strong enough to make sure Linda would be found." Blake marked the spot with flags and nodded to his team. "Let's finish what Dorothy started. Let's bring Linda home." They began to dig, carefully removing soil layer by layer, continuing from where Dorothy's desperate excavation had stopped. I stood with Susan as the hole grew deeper. She held my arm tightly, and I could feel her trembling. At 3.5 feet down, just inches below where Dorothy's fingers had scratched at the clay, the first bone appeared. A femur, still partially articulated with a pelvis. The forensic anthropologist climbed into the hole carefully, using brushes and small tools to expose more of the remains. "Female, approximately 30 to 35 years old at time of death," she said, her voice clinical but respectful. "Skeletal remains are consistent with someone who's been buried approximately 40 years. I can see evidence of perimortem trauma to the skull, blunt force impact consistent with falling or being struck." Susan made a small sound, half sob, half gasp. I put my arm around her shoulders as we watched them carefully excavate Linda Mercer from the ground where she'd lain for 4 decades. It took 3 hours to remove all the remains and document the burial site. When they finally lifted Linda out, placed her gently in a body bag, and zipped it closed, Susan turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "My mother tried to tell us," she said. "For years she tried to tell us. And we thought she was just confused, just losing her mind." "She was losing her mind," I said gently. "But not the part that remembered Linda. Not the part that knew what needed to be done." As we drove back to Seattle that afternoon, the rain finally stopped, and pale winter sunlight broke through the clouds. In the back of the medical examiner's van, Linda Mercer was finally going home. And somewhere, I like to think, Dorothy Raines could finally rest. Later that evening, after we'd returned to Seattle and Linda Mercer's remains were safely in the morgue, Susan called me. "Dr. Cross, I keep thinking about my mother out there in the forest, digging with her bare hands. Alzheimer's had taken almost everything from her. She couldn't remember my name, couldn't remember how to make coffee, couldn't remember what year it was. But she remembered Linda. She remembered those coordinates, and she tried. She did more than try, Susan. She succeeded in what mattered most. She ensured Linda would be found. But she died without knowing that. She died thinking she'd failed, thinking Linda was still alone in the ground." I thought about Dorothy's final words, written in that moment of terminal lucidity. "I tried to find her. I tried to bring her home. Maybe she didn't know Linda would be found," I said carefully. "But I think she knew she'd tried. And I think that brought her some peace. After 40 years of silence, of living with that terrible guilt, she finally acted. She went to that forest and she fought to make it right. That took more courage than most people have in their entire lives." "You think so?" "I know so. Your mother's disease took her memories, her identity, her ability to care for herself. But it didn't take her conscience. It didn't take her love for Linda, and it didn't take her determination to tell the truth, even when her own body fought against her." I paused. "Susan, your mother dug for hours in that forest. An elderly woman with Alzheimer's, alone, exhausted, probably confused about why she was even there. But something inside her kept her digging, some part of her that remembered friendship, that remembered right from wrong, that remembered Linda deserved better. That part of her never stopped fighting. Susan was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Dr. Cross, for finishing what she started, for bringing Linda home, and for helping me understand that my mother, even at the end, was still trying to be the person she wanted to be. The remains of Linda Mercer arrived at my morgue 3 hours after we'd excavated them from that forest in Snohomish County. It's a strange thing, examining bones that have been in the ground for 40 years. The flesh is gone, the organs dissolved. All the soft tissue that usually tells me how someone died has long since returned to the earth. What remains is structure, architecture, the framework that once held a living, breathing person. But even bones tell stories. I've learned over my 17 years in this profession that skeletal remains can reveal secrets that fresh bodies sometimes hide. The way bones heal, the marks left by violence, the subtle signs of disease, all of it remains long after everything else has faded. Linda Mercer's bones were going to tell me exactly how she died, and whether Dorothy Raines's journal had told the complete truth. I called Susan before I began the examination. She had a right to know what I was going to do, what I might find. She answered on the first ring. Dr. Cross? Susan, we're about to begin the forensic examination of Linda Mercer's remains. I wanted you to know before I started, and I wanted to ask if you'd learned anything more about your father, about Robert. There was a long pause. I spent last night going through old photo albums, papers, anything I could find from that time period. I found my mother's medical records from 1983. Dr. Cross, she went to the emergency room on June 8th, 2 days after Linda died. The diagnosis was contusions to the right wrist and forearm, consistent with gripping injury. She told the doctors she'd fallen. But she hadn't fallen. No, my father had grabbed her, just like she wrote in the journal. He hurt her to keep her quiet. Susan's voice was tight with anger. I also found something else. My father inherited that property in Snohomish County from his uncle in 1981, 2 years before Linda died. He knew that land, knew it was isolated. He'd planned it, Dr. Cross. When Linda fell and hit her head, when she died, my father didn't panic. He knew exactly what to do because he'd already thought about it. You think he'd considered killing her before? I think when Linda confronted him about the affair, when she said she had proof and was going to tell everyone, my father saw his life falling apart. His marriage, his reputation, everything. And I think he decided Linda had to disappear. She paused. I don't think her death was an accident at all. I thought about that as I stood over Linda Mercer's remains, laid out on the examination table. If Susan was right, if Robert Raines had deliberately killed Linda, then Dorothy had spent 40 years protecting a murderer, protecting her husband at the cost of her best friend's justice. Or had she known? Had she suspected? Susan, did your mother ever try to leave your father? Ever suggest divorce? No, they stayed married until he died in 1995. But they weren't happy. I remember that much from my childhood. They existed in the same house but lived separate lives. My mother was always sad. I thought it was just her personality, just who she was. Now I know why. Thank you for telling me this. I'll call you when the examination is complete. I hung up and turned to Maya, who was setting up the documentation equipment. Let's find out how Linda Mercer really died. The forensic anthropologist, Marion Webb, had already done a preliminary assessment at the excavation site. Now she joined me for the detailed examination, bringing her expertise in reading the language of bones. Female, approximately 30 to 35 years old, Dr. Webb began, examining the pelvis and skull. Height estimated at 5'6". No evidence of significant prior trauma or disease in the skeletal structure. This was a healthy woman. We moved to the skull, and Dr. Webb's expression grew more serious. Here's the perimortem trauma. Blunt force impact to the right temporal region. She pointed to a depressed fracture, a circular pattern of broken bone about 2 inches in diameter. Consistent with falling and hitting a fireplace corner? I asked. Possibly, but look at the fracture pattern more closely. She positioned a magnifying light over the area. The impact point shows a specific geometric pattern. Square edges, not the irregular surface you'd expect from natural stone. This looks more like impact from a metal object, a tool, or a weapon. I leaned closer, studying the fracture. She was right. The depression in the skull showed right angles, a defined corner that had crushed the bone inward. What kind of tool? Hard to say definitively without comparison samples, but the dimensions suggest something like a hammerhead, or perhaps a heavy metal bookend, something with a squared, striking surface. Could she have fallen onto something like that? It's possible, but the angle is wrong. Dr. Webb used a laser pointer to trace the trajectory of the impact. The blow came from slightly above and behind. If she'd fallen forward onto an object, we'd see impact to the frontal or parietal bones. This is temporal, and the force vector suggests a downward strike from someone standing behind or beside her. I felt a cold certainty settling in my chest. She was hit, deliberately. That would be my assessment, yes. This wasn't an accidental fall. This was blunt force trauma inflicted by another person. I documented everything, photographing the skull from every angle, taking precise measurements of the fracture pattern. Then we continued the examination, looking for any other injuries. We found them in the bones of her hands. Defensive fractures, Dr. Webb said, holding up Linda's right hand. The second and third metacarpals show perimortem fractures. She raised her hands to protect herself, and the same weapon that struck her skull also broke her fingers. She knew it was coming. She tried to defend herself. Yes, and there's more. Dr. Webb moved to the ribs. Fractures here as well. Anterior ribs, 4, 5, and 6 on the left side. These are also perimortem. She was struck multiple times, not just once. I stepped back from the table, my mind reconstructing what had actually happened on June 6, 1983. Linda Mercer hadn't fallen and accidentally hit her head. She'd been attacked. Hit repeatedly with a heavy object. She'd raised her hands to protect herself, but it hadn't been enough. Robert Raines had murdered her, and Dorothy had watched it happen. I called Detective Blake immediately. Warren, the forensic examination is complete. Linda Mercer's death wasn't an accident. She was murdered. Multiple blunt force trauma strikes, defensive wounds, evidence of a sustained attack. Christ. Can you determine what weapon was used? The fracture pattern suggests a metal object with a squared edge. A hammer, possibly, or something similar. But I'd need to see potential weapons to make a comparison. The house where it happened was sold years ago, after Robert Raines died. Current owners have been there since 1998. But I can request a search of the property, see if anything was left behind in the basement or garage. There's something else, Warren. The position of the wounds suggests Robert Raines hit her from behind first, then continued striking as she fell. This wasn't heat of the moment. This was sustained violence. So we're upgrading this from accidental death to homicide. Definitely, Robert Raines is dead, so we can't prosecute him. But Linda Mercer's family deserves to know the truth. And Dorothy, I paused. Dorothy knew. She watched it happen. She helped bury the body. But whether she was a willing accomplice or a terrified victim herself, I'm not sure. That evening, I drove to Susan's house. She lived in a modest neighborhood in North Seattle, a small craftsman-style home with a well-maintained garden. She opened the door before I could knock, her face drawn and tired. "Come in," she said. "I've been waiting." We sat in her living room and I told her everything we'd found. The fracture patterns, the defensive wounds, the evidence that her father had deliberately murdered Linda Mercer. Susan listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a small box. "After you called this afternoon, I went to my storage unit. I'd packed away my father's things after he died, stuff I couldn't bring myself to look at but couldn't throw away." She opened the box and pulled out a photograph. "This is my parents in 1982, a year before Linda died." The photo showed a couple in their early 30s standing in front of a house. Robert Raines was tall, dark-haired, with a controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dorothy stood beside him, looking thin and nervous, her smile forced. "My father was a controlling man," Susan said. "I didn't realize it as a child, but looking back now I can see it. He decided everything. Where we lived, where I went to school, who my mother could spend time with. She had no friends, no life outside our house. I thought she was just shy, just introverted. Now I understand. He'd isolated her, completely." She pulled out another item from the box, a small metal bookend in the shape of a horse. "This was in my father's study. He kept his accounting books between a pair of these." I took the bookend carefully, feeling its weight. It was heavy, solid metal, with a squared base about 2 inches across, the same dimensions as the fracture in Linda Mercer's skull. "Susan, I need to take this as evidence." "I know. I figured that's why you came." She looked at the bookend, her expression unreadable. "He kept this in his study for years, sat at his desk every night doing his paperwork, with the murder weapon holding up his books. How could someone do that? How could someone live with that?" Some people compartmentalize. They put terrible things into a box in their mind and never open it. They go on living as if nothing happened. But my mother couldn't do that. She tried to forget, tried to move on, but she couldn't. And when the Alzheimer's took everything else away, what remained was the guilt, the memory of what they'd done. Susan wiped her eyes. "Do you think she was a victim too? Or do you think she was complicit?" It was the question I'd been wrestling with since I'd first read Dorothy's journal. "I think she was both. Victim of your father's violence and control, yes, but also complicit in covering up Linda's murder and letting her friend's family suffer for 40 years without answers." I paused. "But Susan, I also think Dorothy spent every day of those 40 years in her own kind of prison. The guilt, the fear, the weight of what she'd done, it never left her. And in the end, when she was dying, when almost everything else was gone, she tried to make it right. She tried to tell the truth. But it was too late. She should have told someone years ago, decades ago. You're right. But trauma, fear, and control can make people do things they know are wrong. Your father hurt her, threatened her, made her believe she had no choice. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps explain it." Susan was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I could talk to her, just one more time. I wish I could ask her why. Why she stayed silent. Why she protected him." Maybe she answered that question in her last days. When she kept saying Linda's name, when she wrote those coordinates over and over, she was finally breaking her silence, finally choosing Linda over the secret. It took her 40 years, but she chose right in the end. The next morning, Detective Blake held a press conference announcing the resolution of Linda Mercer's missing person case. Linda's sister, Patricia Mercer, now 69 years old, attended. I watched the live stream from my office. Patricia stood at the podium, her face lined with age and grief, and spoke in a steady voice. My family has spent 40 years wondering what happened to Linda, wondering if she was alive somewhere, if she'd chosen to leave us, if we'd somehow failed her. Now we know the truth. It's not the answer we wanted, but it's an answer. And we can finally bring Linda home. We can finally lay her to rest. A reporter asked about Robert and Dorothy Raines. Patricia's expression hardened. Robert Raines is dead. He can't face justice for what he did. But I hope wherever he is, he knows that his crime was discovered, that he didn't get away with it after all. She paused. As for Dorothy Raines, I've thought a lot about her these past few days. She was Linda's best friend. They grew up together. And she stayed silent for 40 years while our family suffered. I'm angry about that. I'll probably always be angry about that. But I also know she was afraid. And in the end, she tried to tell the truth. She tried to bring Linda home. So I'm choosing to believe that the Dorothy who loved Linda was still in there somewhere. And I'm grateful that part of her fought through the fear and the disease to do the right thing. I thought about that statement as I completed my final report on both Dorothy Raines and Linda Mercer. Two women, best friends, whose lives had been destroyed by one man's violence. One who'd died in 1983, the other who'd spent the next 40 years dying slowly from guilt and fear. Dr. Helena Moss, the neurologist who'd treated Dorothy during her final hospitalization, called me that afternoon. Dr. Cross, I heard about the case, about what you found. I wanted to tell you something about Dorothy's last days that didn't make it into the medical records. What is it? On her final night, December 7th, Dorothy was agitated, kept trying to get out of bed, saying she needed to go, that Linda was waiting. We sedated her lightly, tried to calm her. But around midnight, she suddenly became very lucid, completely clear for the first time in days. The night nurse documented it as a terminal lucidity event, that burst of clarity some patients experience near the end. What did she say? She asked for a pen and paper, wrote something down, then asked the nurse to make sure her daughter got it. The nurse put it with Dorothy's belongings, but I don't think Susan ever saw it. It probably got mixed in with hospital paperwork. Dr. Moss paused. I made a copy before it was packed away. I thought you should know what it said. She read it aloud. Susan, I'm sorry. Sorry for the mother I wasn't. Sorry for the truth I never told. Sorry for the coward I became. But I need you to know I loved Linda. She was the best person I knew, and I failed her. I failed her when she needed me most, and I failed her every day after. But I tried to find her. I tried to bring her home. Tell her family I'm sorry. Tell them I never forgot. Tell them Linda deserved so much better than what I gave her, than what Robert did to her. I'm going now to wherever people like me go. I hope Linda is there. I hope she'll let me apologize. I hope she'll forgive me. I love you, Susan. Be braver than I was. Mom. When Dr. Moss finished reading, I sat in silence for a moment. Can you send that to me? Susan needs to see it. I already mailed it to her this morning. I called Susan immediately and told her to check her mail. 20 minutes later, she called me back, crying. She remembered me, Susan said through her tears. At the very end, she remembered who I was, and she tried to tell me the truth. She did tell you the truth, just not in time to say it herself. Dr. Cross, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think she found Linda after she died? Do you think Linda forgave her? I thought about Dorothy Raines, spending her last burst of clarity writing an apology to the friend she'd buried 40 years ago. I thought about Linda Mercer lying in the forest for 4 decades waiting to be found. I'd like to think so, I said. I'd like to think they're both finally at peace. Linda Mercer's funeral was held on a cold, gray morning in early January. 40 years and 7 months after she disappeared. I didn't usually attend funerals for the people whose autopsies I performed. Professional distance, they call it. The ability to separate the work from the emotion, the body from the person. But this case was different. Susan Raines asked me to come, and I said yes. Not just as the medical examiner who'd helped solve the case, but as someone who'd been moved by Dorothy's desperate attempt to tell the truth before she died. The service was held at a small church in Everett, the town where Linda had lived and worked. About 60 people attended, mostly Linda's family and old friends who'd never forgotten her. Patricia Mercer, Linda's sister, had arranged everything with careful attention to detail, as if making up for 40 years of not being able to properly say goodbye. I sat in the back, watching as people approached the closed casket, each placing a hand on the polished wood, each saying their own private farewell. Susan sat near the front, alone. She told me the night before that she wasn't sure she had the right to be there, that her family had caused all this pain, but Patricia had called her personally and asked her to come. "Your mother tried to make it right," Patricia had said. "That means something." The pastor spoke about loss and forgiveness, about the long road to healing. Then Patricia stood to give the eulogy. "Linda was 31 when she died," Patricia began, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "She was my big sister, my best friend, my protector. When she disappeared in 1983, part of me disappeared with her. For 40 years, I've lived in two worlds. The world where people go to work and raise families and celebrate birthdays, and the world where my sister might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found." She paused, composing herself. "Now I know she wasn't out there. She was in the ground, alone in the dark, for longer than she'd been alive. And that knowledge is painful, but there's also relief, because Linda is finally home, finally at rest, and the questions that haunted our family for 4 decades have been answered." Patricia looked directly at Susan. "Dorothy Raines helped bury my sister. She stayed silent while our family suffered. And I'm angry about that. I probably always will be. But I'm also grateful. Grateful that in her final days, when her mind was almost completely gone, the part of her that loved Linda remained. That part fought through disease and fear to tell the truth. That part led Dr. Cross and the investigators to the forest where Linda had been waiting all these years." She turned back to the congregation. "So, today, as we lay Linda to rest properly, I'm also making peace with Dorothy Raines. I'm choosing to believe that the woman who loved my sister was still there at the end, and I'm grateful to her for finally bringing Linda home." After the service, Patricia approached me in the church parking lot. Susan stood beside me, and I could feel her tension as Linda's sister walked toward us. But Patricia didn't come with anger. She came with something that looked like understanding. "Dr. Cross, thank you for everything you did, for caring enough to follow the evidence wherever it led, for treating my sister with respect even after all these years." "It was my honor," I said simply. Patricia turned to Susan. "And you. I know this has been terrible for you. Learning what your father did, what your mother hid, I can't imagine carrying that weight." "I'm so sorry," Susan said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what they did to Linda, to your family. If I could change it." "You can't," Patricia interrupted gently. "None of us can change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. And I'm choosing to separate you from your parents' actions. You were a child when this happened. You didn't know. And your mother tried, at the end, to make it right. That has to count for something." The two women embraced, both crying, both carrying grief for losses that could never be undone. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about the case more than usual. Usually, once I complete an autopsy and file my report, I move on to the next case. There's always another body, another mystery, another death that needs to be understood. But Dorothy Raines stayed with me. Maybe it was because of my own mother, who was aging, who sometimes forgot where she'd put her keys or mixed up the names of her grandchildren. Every time she called me, asking the same question she'd asked the day before, I felt that familiar fear. Would I lose her the way Susan had lost Dorothy? Would the disease take everything until all that remained was a shell? Or would something remain? Some core part of her, some essential truth that survived even when everything else was gone. I called my mother on a Saturday evening in late January. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding slightly out of breath. "Nathan, I was just thinking about you. How's work?" "Busy. How are you, Mom?" "Oh, getting older. My knee's been bothering me and I can't remember if I took my blood pressure medication this morning. Probably did. Or maybe that was yesterday." She laughed. "Sometimes I think I'm losing my mind." "You're not losing your mind. You're 71. It's normal to forget small things." "Is it? Or is this how it starts? Like what happened to Margaret Chen down the street. One day she was fine, the next she couldn't remember her own daughter's name. Now she's in a nursing home, and her daughter says she doesn't even recognize her anymore." I thought about Dorothy Raines, who couldn't remember her daughter but could remember coordinates from 40 years ago, who couldn't remember her own name but could remember that Linda Mercer needed to be found. "Mom, if something like that happened to you, if you started to forget things, what would you want?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if there was something important you needed to remember, something you needed to tell someone, what would it be?" She was quiet for a moment. "That's a morbid question, Nathan. I know, but I've been thinking about memory lately, about what we hold on to and what we let go. And I'm curious what you'd consider essential. What would you fight to remember even if everything else was gone?" "You," she said simply. "You and your sister, my children, that's what would matter. The love I have for both of you. Everything else, the addresses I've lived at, the jobs I've worked, the mistakes I've made, all of that could go. But loving you two, that's who I am. That's the part I'd need to keep." I felt my throat tighten. "That's a good answer, Mom. Why are you really calling, Nathan? What's wrong?" I told her about the case. Not all the details, not the graphic parts, but the essential truth. A woman with Alzheimer's who forgot almost everything except the one thing that mattered most. The secret she'd carried for 40 years. The friend she'd failed. "And in the end," I said, "when her brain was almost completely gone, that memory remained. That guilt remained, and it pushed her to tell the truth." My mother was quiet for a long time. That poor woman, carrying that weight for so long, never able to put it down. "Do you think she made the right choice? At the end, I mean, trying to confess." "Of course she did. The truth always matters, Nathan. Even when it's painful, even when it comes too late. That woman's friend deserved to be found. Her family deserved answers. And Dorothy, that was her name? Yes. Dorothy deserved to finally tell someone. To finally put down that terrible burden before she died. I think what she did took courage. More courage than staying silent did." After I hung up with my mother, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about courage, about the different forms it takes. The courage to tell the truth. The courage to face consequences. The courage to dig in the dirt with your bare hands, trying to uncover what you'd helped bury 4 decades earlier. Detective Blake called me in mid-February. "Cross, I thought you'd want to know. We tracked down Robert Raines's medical records from 1983. The week after Linda Mercer disappeared, he went to the ER for a hand injury. Told the doctors he'd hit it with a hammer while doing home repairs. His hand was injured when he killed her. That's my assessment. The defensive wounds on Linda's hands, she fought back. Probably injured him in the process. He needed medical attention but couldn't say how it really happened. Did you find the actual murder weapon? No. The property has been through 3 owners since the Rainses lived there. If the bookend was the weapon, Robert either disposed of it or it was thrown away years ago. But the one Susan gave us is identical in size and weight to the injury pattern on Linda's skull. It's enough for my report. So the case is officially closed? As closed as it can be with the perpetrator dead. Linda Mercer's death has been ruled a homicide, committed by Robert Raines with Dorothy Raines as an accomplice who helped conceal the crime. The family has closure. Justice of a sort has been served. He paused. It's not perfect, but it's the truth, and that's what we promised them. The truth. That's what Dorothy Raines had finally given after 40 years. Not perfect justice, not redemption, but truth. I completed my final report on both Dorothy Raines and Linda Mercer in early March. The documents were extensive, detailed, documenting every finding, every piece of evidence, every conclusion drawn from the investigation. But there was one thing I added that wasn't standard. A personal note attached to the end of Dorothy's autopsy report. During my 17 years as a medical examiner, I've learned that the body rarely lies. It tells stories in blood and bone, in tissue and trauma. But this case taught me something new. It taught me that even when the brain is failing, even when memory itself is being destroyed by disease, some truths are so fundamental, so essential, that they survive. Dorothy Raines forgot her daughter's name, her own address, how to perform basic tasks of daily living. But she remembered Linda Mercer. She remembered the terrible thing that had been done. And she remembered that it was wrong. In her final days, stripped of almost everything that made her who she was, what remained was conscience. The knowledge that her best friend deserved better. That Linda's family deserved the truth. That some secrets should not stay buried forever. Medical science can explain how Alzheimer's disease progresses, which brain structures fail first, how neural networks deteriorate. But it cannot fully explain why certain memories persist while others vanish, why trauma and guilt can survive when love and joy cannot, why Dorothy Raines could draw a map to Linda Mercer's grave but couldn't find her way home. Perhaps what survives longest isn't memory at all, but the need to make things right, the desperate human drive to confess, to atone, to bring light to darkness before our own light goes out. Dorothy Raines did that. Not in time to spare anyone pain, not soon enough to give Linda's family 40 years of their grief back, but in time to ensure that Linda was found, that she was brought home, that the truth was finally told. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To face our failures, to speak our truths, and to do what's right even when it costs us everything. Dorothy Raines did that, and I believe that matters. Susan called me in late March. Dr. Cross, I wanted to tell you something. I visited my mother's grave today, first time since the funeral. And I brought flowers for Linda Mercer, too. They're buried in different cemeteries, miles apart. But somehow it felt important to honor them both. That was kind of you. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to process everything. Who my father really was, what my mother lived through, how to make sense of growing up in a house built on such terrible secrets. She paused. The therapist asked me if I forgive them. My parents. I said I don't know yet, maybe someday. But I understand them better now, and that's a start. That sounds healthy. Dr. Cross, can I ask you something? In all your years doing this work, examining bodies, investigating deaths, what have you learned about people? About what we're really made of? I thought about that question, about the thousands of bodies I'd opened, the thousands of stories I'd read in Tissue and Bone, about Dorothy Raines and Linda Mercer and all the people whose final chapters I'd helped write. "I've learned that we're complicated," I said finally. "That people can be both victim and accomplice, both coward and hero. That we carry things we shouldn't have to carry, and we make choices we shouldn't have to make. And sometimes the best we can do is try, at the very end, to tell the truth. To make one thing right before it's too late. My mother did that. Yes, she did." After I hung up, I looked out my office window at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were living with secrets, carrying guilt, making choices they'd regret. And someday, some of them would end up on my table, and I'd try to read their stories, to understand what their bodies could tell me about how they'd lived and how they'd died. But I'd never forget Dorothy Raines, the woman whose disease took everything except her conscience, who dug in the dirt with her bare hands, trying to uncover the truth, who wrote coordinates over and over in those final days, fighting against the darkness in her mind to bring one small light into the world. Memory is fragile, bodies fail, lives end. But some truths refuse to stay buried. And sometimes the disease that takes everything else away reveals what was hidden all along. My name is Dr. Nathan Cross, and I've been a medical examiner for 17 years. I've learned that death is rarely the end of a story. It's often the beginning of the truth. And sometimes the most important thing a person does is remember, against all odds, what needs to be remembered. Dorothy Raines remembered. And because she did, Linda Mercer came home. If this story moved you, if it made you think about memory and truth and the secrets we carry, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me about the truths that matter to you, the things you'd fight to remember even if everything else was gone. And if you want more real medical cases that reveal what it means to be human, make sure you're subscribed. Because every body that comes to my table has a story, and some stories need to be told.